Well, let's hope this is working. This should go on page 91 in your notebooks. Um, we're taking a look at the Roaring Twenties. Now, you can describe the Roaring Twenties either because of the roar of an economic engine that's just screaming down the highway, or what we're going to see next time, the roar of that monster under the bed. But let's start with the interesting economic turning points first. So you can see here in the essential question, we have significant economic turning points and cultural changes in the 1920s. We'll start with economics because we know coming out of World War I, yes, there's a slight dip transitioning from the wartime economy into the peacetime economy. But all that deficit spending from World War I, all of that economic investment is going to impact the 1920s. Let's see. The 1920s is the first time that we're going to see more people living in urban areas than in rural areas. Now that's going all the way back to the Gilded Age. That's moving us through that progressive era. We can see that in the 1920s there's going to be a higher urban population. People are moving to the cities to get jobs. They're moving away from the rural countryside to places that are more diverse. This is a product also of the Great Migration, with the African American population moving from the rural South up into the urban North. And because of this, the 1920s are going to be a time of a lot of tension and fear. There's going to be a conflict between this modernity, this modernism, and traditional values from like the countryside. Urban versus rural, science versus religion. We're going to touch on all that stuff. In this advertisement, you can see a couple of important things of the 1920s. First, and most importantly, is this part here where it says 50 cents down. 50 cents down and then $1 a month. And all of these wonderful new gadgets, all these wonderful new pieces of technology that are coming out of this industrialization and mass production, they're expensive. But that doesn't mean people can't buy them. It just means that they're going to have to borrow to buy it. We call this installment buying or buying on credit. Once the United States comes out of World War I, all of those gains that they had from the progressive era are largely lost. All of the workers' protections, all of the breaking of the monopolies, Warren Harding, and then eventually Calvin Coolidge, and finally Herbert Hoover, they believe that the government should not be regulating these businesses. And because they're not regulating the businesses, we see a return back to laissez-faire, right? The government is not going to be putting regulations on these businesses, and they're not regulating a lot of things, assuming that those rich people know what they're doing and that they're going to do what's best for, well, they thought the best for the country. Calvin Coolidge is going to say the business of America is business. We're going to see that's going to be a little bit problematic. Assembly lines do lead to price drops. Okay, mass production means there's more supply. With more supply, but the same amount of demand, that's going to lower prices. Businesses can make more money selling more products. It's good for them while the prices are actually going down. Some of that stuff is expensive, though, so we can see all this buying on credit here. Now, the tricky part of the 1920s is the concept of financial speculation. And when you see the word speculation, I want you to think in your mind the word gambling. Now, everybody in the 1920s assumed that the stock market was always going to increase in value. But there's nothing inherent in the stock market that means that the value of the stock market is always going to go up. Over time, the value of the stock market overall tends to increase, but the value of individual stocks fluctuates wildly. And just because it went up in November doesn't mean it's going to go up in December, and that's going to become a bit of a problem. And the big problem for the 1920s was buying on margin. Now, let's assume, for example, you have $100. We have one column here, right? One column, there's $10 purchases. If you have $100 and you want to invest in the stock market, you could buy one stock, right, at $100. Now, let's say that stock goes up in value $10. What that means is you buy that one stock for $100, the stock goes up in value to $110, and then you've made a $10 profit. But that's not good enough for these investors. No, what they want is to make massive amounts of profit with the lowest amount of investment possible. So they start borrowing money to invest in the stock market. They would borrow up to 90% of the value of a stock. So instead of buying one $100 stock, they would buy 10 $100 stocks. They've still only spent $100 because they're borrowing 90%. They're spending 100, borrowing 900 under the assumption that the value of the stock is going to go up. So that when they sell off that stock, they will sell off their stock, they will pay off the $900 that they borrowed, and then they get to keep whatever's left over. So now if that stock goes up in value $10, they don't make $10 because they bought one stock. They have made $100 because they are selling off 10 $100 stocks. So they're keeping an extra $100 on top of that. To them, it's smart money. But the assumption is that the value of the stock is always going to go up. The problem is, as soon as the value of the stock drops, all those people that are loaning out the money want their money back, and they have what's called a margin call. So they will force the people that borrow the money to sell off their stock so that the people that loaned out the money get their money back. That floods the market with more supply, and as we just talked about, more supply lowers price. So we're going to see how this buying on margin is going to cause the stock market crash from going from kind of a blip in the stock market to, a crash in the stock market. It's that unregulation, that lack of regulation in the stock market that's going to lead to that explosion throughout the 1920s, but then eventually the massive collapse at the end of the 1920s. A couple other things culturally. We can see that new technologies, some of those new technologies coming about in this era, things like movies and radio, are national communication tools. And the movies and the radios are going to be a way for the United States to create a common culture. And that means that people are going to start speaking similarly. They're going to start dressing similarly. Their behaviors are going to become less regional. So it's not a big a difference to go from, say, New York to California to Florida. We still feel that way in the modern era, but it's not as big as it would have been, say, in the 1880s. The interesting thing is these movies are incredibly racist. This guy up here is Al Jolson. He's a white guy. He's going to be wearing blackface in a movie called The Jazz Singer. This movie over here, we already talked about this. This is The Birth of a Nation, 1914, wins all the Oscars. Ku Klux Klan are the heroes, the good guys that come riding to save the day. So the movies are pretty racist, but interestingly, it's going to help acclimate immigrants. What that means is it helps immigrants and other people that come into the United States, it helps them understand what it means to be an American. It helps teach them English. It helps them to understand how to dress and how to behave. Kind of interesting that mass media is going to help for that. The 1920s is when we also see the first real pop culture starting to move. And by pop culture, we're talking about national culture. Things like Babe Ruth and baseball over there, right? Baseball becomes the national pastime, and Babe Ruth became a huge celebrity. Advertising is going to allow people to see products that are available, but it's also going to teach them what they should want to buy. Over here, we got jazz, right? Louis Armstrong and jazz. These pop culture elements are going to help create national values and interests among the United States citizens. Speaking of the assembly line, we can thank Henry Ford for that. We got Henry Ford up here. The assembly line is going to lead to mass production. Mass production means that things can be produced more efficiently. By producing them more efficiently, you can pump out a whole lot more product in the same amount of time, and that means that the supply goes up, demand stays the same, supply goes up, and that means the prices are going to drop. You can see over here the value of a Model T, the amount that it costs to purchase one, drops drastically as a result of the introduction of the assembly line. Now, I told you before, I worked in a factory for a couple of summers, and here's the problem with working in a factory. It is monotonous and soul-crushing, and it is a 10 to 12 hour repetitive shift. It was so difficult working on the assembly line, because literally your job might just be to tighten the lug nut on the left front tires of a Model T as it comes down the railway for 10 or 12 hours. It's horrible as a mental thing. Ford ended up having to pay astronomical wages for the time period. He was paying $5 a day in a time period when most factories were paying about $1 a day. And it came with a lot of catches. If you were absent, you were fired. If you showed up drunk, you were fired. If you were insubordinate and talked back to your manager, you were fired, because there's always somebody there that wanted to get that extra cash and always somebody to replace you. It's also unskilled labor. And even though that unskilled labor is getting paid really well because of the $5 a day, there is an awful lot of control being placed on that labor. Unlike skilled labor that has a lot of bargaining power. They can try to get paid more, but also be treated better. So unskilled labor is going to get bad wages and bad conditions. And once the assembly line really kind of takes hold across the country, that's when that $5 workday doesn't seem so special, and the wages start to drop. This is Charlie Chaplin here, by the way. He had a very famous movie called Modern Times, which he literally becomes a cog in the machine. And that's how people were feeling in that era. We'll pick up on social fears of the 1920s next time.